The Little Lemon restaurant wants to expand its service by taking online orders to deliver food to customers at home. To do this, they need their customers to set up an account on their website. In this video, you will learn how to create a simple sign-up form for user accounts on the Little Lemon website. I have set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named signup.html. I start off by adding the form element. The restaurant requires that the customer data is sent securely, so I will set the method attribute to post so that it is submitted using an HTTP post request. You will learn more about different methods of form submission later. For now, you just need to know that if you send a form via an HTTP post request, it improves the data security of the form. The restaurant wants to collect the customer's first name, last name, and email address. Of course, the form also needs a field for the password and another to confirm the password, so I need to create a form with 5 fields in total. I'll start by adding the input elements, also known as the form fields. First, I'll set up 6 div elements, 1 for each input element and 1 for the sign up button. The div elements will cause each field of the form to display in its own CSS block. Now I'll start adding the input elements. I add an input element for the first name to the first div element. Since the user will input plain text for this form field, I set the type attribute to text. I also set the name and ID attributes to user first name. Remember that the name attribute sets the key for the value submitted to the web server. Later in this video, I will explain why I set the ID attribute. Next, I add an input element for the last name. Like the first name element, I set the type attribute to text and the name and ID attributes to user last name. I then add an input element for the email address. To make sure users enter a valid email address in this field, I set the type attribute to email. Earlier you learned that doing so establishes HTML's client-side validation. I also set the name and ID attributes to user email. Next, I add the input element for the password. I want the password to be hidden on screen as the user types it, so I set the type attribute to password. When an input field is set to password, each character that a user enters will display as a placeholder character, such as a bullet point. The content in the field will contain the password that the user enters, but it will be hidden. I then set the name and ID attributes to user password. Finally, I add the input element for confirming the password. Again, I set the type to password to hide the content of the input field on screen. I then set the name and ID attributes to user confirm password. Now that our input fields are set up, I save the file and open the live preview to check the web page. Everything displays correctly. However, I'd like to improve the user experience by informing the user what each field represents. To do this, I'll add a label element before each input element. And now I want to explain why I set the ID attribute for each input field earlier in the video. The reason for this is that it allows me to associate a label with each input element. Labels improve the user experience and assist accessibility software in understanding the form. I now add a label element above the first input element. Inside the label element, I add the descriptive text for the input field. In this case, the text description will be first name. Then, to associate the label with the input field, I add the for attribute and set its value to match the value of the ID attribute of the input element. Finally, I'll add a line break tag after the label element so that the input field displays below the label. I then repeat the same process for each input element. I save the file again and open the live preview. Ah yes, that's much better. The form labels now display above the input fields. To finalize the form, I need to add one more thing, the Submit button. Inside the last div element, I add a button element. I set the button type attribute to Submit. Then inside the button element, I add the text Sign Up. I save the file again and open the live preview. The form is now ready to use. Once the backend is set up by a backend developer to accept the data submitted via the form, users will be able to create their accounts. In this video, you learned how to create a basic form with several different input fields, each in its own CSS block. You covered how to set the method attribute to submit the form in a secure way. And you also now know how to associate a label with an input field to improve the user experience. Good luck with creating your own sign-up forms.